Decades after the war ended, a rusted helmet was discovered buried deep in the ruins of an old battlefield. Inside, folded and yellowed with age, lay a single photograph. Two young soldiers smiling, brothers not by blood, but by the bond of survival. No names written, no records found. Just a forgotten picture, hidden inside the steel shell that once saved a life. Who were they? Why was the photo left behind? And how could one relic, unearthed years later, reopen a story of sacrifice and friendship, long buried under ash and silence? This is not just a tale of war. It's a human story of loyalty, memory, and the bonds that even death could not erase. Welcome to The Photograph in the Helmet, the story of a friendship the world almost forgot. It was decades after the war had ended. Ravenwood Forest, once a battlefield filled with smoke and fire, had become silent, a place where trees grew tall over forgotten trenches and grass hid the scars of the past. On a late autumn afternoon, a group of hikers stumbled across something unusual. Half buried in the mud, glinting faintly under the weak sunlight, was a rusted steel helmet. Its edges were jagged, its surface pitted with age and shrapnel scars. One of the men knelt and carefully lifted it from the soil. As he tilted it, something fluttered loose inside. Not bullets, not dirt, but a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with time. When the hikers opened it, they froze. It was a photograph. Two young soldiers in uniform, arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling as if the war around them didn't exist. Their faces were full of life, their eyes shining with the innocence of friendship. No names, no notes, just the picture, hidden for decades inside a helmet that had once shielded a life. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Who were they? And why had this relic remained buried in silence for so long? In that moment, the helmet was no longer just rusted steel. It was a key to a story the world had almost forgotten. Ellis carefully slid the photograph out of the helmet, his weathered fingers trembling as though afraid the fragile paper might crumble to dust in his hands. The image was worn, its edges browned and curled, as if it had survived both fire and time. Two young soldiers stood in the photograph, arms around each other, their uniforms still crisp, their faces lit with the kind of hope only youth can carry into war. Their smiles were unshaken, as though the horrors of the battlefield could never touch them. Ellis froze. His breath caught in his throat. One of those faces, despite the decades that had passed, was unmistakable. It was Mark Turner. Ellis's chest tightened as memories surged forward, crashing through the dam he had built over the years. He remembered the morning fog that hung over the trenches, the deafening roar of artillery, the cries for medics, and the choking stench of gunpowder. That day, Mark had vanished in the chaos. The official record said he was missing in action. Everyone else believed he had fallen, another casualty swallowed by war. But here he was, smiling back at Ellis from a photograph hidden in a forgotten helmet. The questions tore through Ellis's mind. Had Mark died right here where the helmet was found? Or had he survived longer than anyone imagined, leaving behind this photograph as a message, a clue? Ellis's hands shook harder, his vision blurred, not from age but from the sudden storm of emotion. This wasn't just a picture. It was a doorway, a silent voice calling from the past. And in that attic, surrounded by shadows and dust, Ellis whispered to himself, "Mark, what happened to you?" That night, Ellis couldn't sleep. The photograph sat on his nightstand, its faded smile glowing faintly in the moonlight like an ember refusing to die. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Mark's face returned, not as the boy in the picture, but as he had last seen him, bloodied, shouting over the chaos, and then vanishing into the smoke. Ellis had spent decades convincing himself that Mark's fate was sealed that day. It was easier to accept the silence of the grave than to wrestle with the endless what-ifs. But now this photo had cracked open a door he thought was locked forever. The next morning, Ellis drove into town with the photograph carefully tucked into his jacket. His first stop was the local Veterans Hall, a quiet building lined with flags and plaques where the scent of old wood and coffee lingered. He laid the photo on the counter, sliding it toward a man named Harris, one of the oldest surviving members of their division. Harris adjusted his glasses, leaned close, and stared. His hand trembled. "Good God, that's Turner," Harris muttered, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Ellis, where did you find this?" Ellis told him about the helmet in the attic, about the dust and silence, about the photograph hidden like a secret waiting to be discovered. Harris sat back, his eyes moist, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Finally, Harris said, "There were rumors, whispers that Turner didn't die that day. Some said he was captured, some said he was seen weeks later, limping but alive. Command brushed it off as battlefield gossip. But Ellis, if this photo was here, maybe the truth never made it home." Ellis felt a shiver run down his spine. The helmet wasn't just a relic, it was evidence, a silent testimony to a story left unfinished. And with that realization, Ellis made a decision. For Mark, for the promise they made to always come home together. He would uncover the truth, no matter how late, no matter how painful. Harris held the photograph with trembling hands, his fingers brushing over the faded edges as though they were made of glass. His eyes shimmered, heavy with decades of memories that words could never capture. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. The silence stretched, thick and almost sacred, until Ellis broke it with a voice roughened by time. "That day, I thought I had lost you forever." Harris swallowed hard, his throat tight, his voice shaking as it finally emerged. "And I thought you were still out there, still fighting." For years, every morning before I faced the world, it was your face in that helmet that gave me the strength to breathe again. The Veterans Hall had grown utterly still. Men and women, some decorated soldiers, others young recruits just beginning their journeys, sat frozen in their chairs. The chatter had vanished. All eyes were locked on the two men reunited not just with each other, but with their past. Harris pressed the photograph against his chest, holding it like a lifeline, before placing it gently back into Ellis's hands. His voice cracked, but his words carried a weight no metal could rival. "This isn't just a keepsake. This photograph is the reason I survived. It kept me alive when everything else told me to give up." Ellis lowered his gaze, his weathered features hardening, though his eyes glistened. His reply was quiet, but resolute, like a promise carried across the years. "Then maybe that's why fate returned it to me after all this time. Not as a relic, but as proof." A hush fell over the hall, so deep it seemed to absorb every sound. It wasn't the silence of fear or shame this time. It was the silence of reverence, an unspoken understanding that they weren't merely witnessing the reunion of two men. They were witnessing history itself, living, breathing, and finally being seen. The story of the photograph spread through the town like wildfire. Newspapers picked it up, local radio stations whispered about it, and soon people from miles away came to the small Veterans Hall just to see the two men who had reunited after a lifetime apart. On a quiet Sunday morning, the hall was filled again. Townspeople, young cadets, and elderly veterans stood side by side. At the center, James and Robert sat together, the photograph now framed in glass between them. Their hands rested firmly on the table, not as fragile men, but as brothers who had endured the storm of war and carried its silence for decades. Then, something remarkable happened. Without any announcement, the entire room rose to their feet. One by one, hats were removed, hands pressed over hearts, and veterans in the crowd snapped into a salute. James, his eyes glistening, turned to Robert. Robert nodded, his voice low but steady. "We didn't just survive. We kept each other alive." In that moment, the photograph in the helmet was no longer just a forgotten relic. It had become a bridge, connecting past to present, silence to memory, strangers to brothers. And for the first time in decades, James and Robert stood together, their trembling hands rising in one final salute. The story of the helmet and the photograph spread beyond the town. Local newspapers carried the tale, calling it "The Photograph in the Helmet." Soon, people from neighboring cities traveled just to see the simple glass frame that now rested in the Veterans Hall. But for the two old soldiers, it was never about fame. They came to the hall quietly, sometimes together, sometimes alone, and sat in silence near the display. The photograph was not just paper, it was a promise, a bond that had survived fire, loss, and time itself. On Veterans Day, a crowd gathered. Flags lined the street, children held small banners, and the town stood still. The two veterans walked together, shoulders bent with age but steady in purpose, and stopped before the memorial wall. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The salute they gave that day was not only for each other, but for every comrade whose faces lived only in memory. And as the crowd watched, many understood something they had never truly grasped before, that sometimes the greatest stories are not written in books or shouted from podiums. They are carried in silence, etched in photographs, and remembered in the hearts of those who choose never to forget. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with others who should hear it. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next inspiring story of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Every subscription, like, and comment helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Together, we keep their legacy alive.